Hi, my name is Torsten Menge, and this is a presentation for the 2021 Social Ontology Conference. And the title of the presentation is Power's Expressive Role and the Essential Contestedness of Social Ontology. So I take it that understanding power is a central task for social theorizing. But this task seems to be impeded by deep disagreements about this concept. Some of these disagreements, I would like to suggest, reflect the lack of a clear understanding of what it is that we're doing when we use the concept. Right? Do we use it to describe, to explain, to evaluate, to assign responsibility, to politicize, to critique? Right? And how do different uses of the concept relate to one another? The default assumption in many debates about the concept is that at its core, power is a descriptive concept. Right? It tracks or is supposed to track some feature in the world, right? A causal factor or causal factors that allows to explain individual behavior, social patterns, social change, and other things like that. According to this view, right, participants in these debates about the concept of power disagree about the precise nature and contours of this feature and its explanatory scope. So in this talk, I want to discuss an approach that starts with a very different understanding of what it is that we're doing when we use the concept, when we talk about power. The philosopher Joseph Rouse, throughout his work in the philosophy of science and in interdisciplinary science studies, has argued that power should be understood as an expressive concept. The concept, he argues, allows us to make explicit and reason about the normative significance of causal relations. So I'm going to elaborate this idea in the next 10 minutes or so, and then think about some of its implications for social ontology more generally. So let me first explicate Rouse's claim that power is an expressive concept by elaborating four central ideas that I think are involved in this claim. So first, for Rouse, power has normative significance in the sense that power and its exercise shape the space in which we meaningfully act and interact. So the exercise of the causal capacities of agents, of institutions, and of other kind of broadly social material arrangements reconfigure the meaningful situations in which various courses of action are intelligible possibilities for the agents within them. So what we're able to do in general, right, depends on what other agents do or are willing to do. And for relatively disempowered agents, right, their ability to do even the most mundane things often is substantially dependent on the actions and commitments of others. Powerful agents, on the other hand, right, are agents who are not as vulnerable to the decisions and commitments of others. And on the flip side, their actions and commitments can often significantly shape the field of actions available to other agents. Right? Secondly, Rouse holds that we cannot understand power as something that's possessed by some agent, right, by some dominant agent. Relations of power are situated within broader social alignments in which specific actions become possible, right, and these alignments include actors as well as various material things in our material environment. And these alignments are dynamic in nature. That is, they have to be sustained or otherwise transformed over time in response to efforts by affected agents to use these alignments, to strengthen them, to weaken them, to resist them, or to bypass them. Now, local relations of power can become linked to one another strategically, sometimes with the effect of making them more durable and robust. But power, for Rouse, and here Rouse is following Foucault, is not an underlying or unifying factor that holds these relations together, right? It's not a commodity, an institution, a structure, or any other sort of thing or property. Okay. Third, right, in order to analyze the pragmatic role of power vocabulary, Rouse turns to Robert Brandom's expressivist conception of logical, semantic, pragmatic, and epistemic vocabularies. Brandom argues that these vocabularies are expressive in the sense that they enable us to say explicitly what we would otherwise only be able to do. So logical vocabulary, right, conditionals, for example, enable us to articulate and discuss inferential practices and their proprieties. Semantic vocabulary enables us to articulate what we are doing when we are asserting or naming or describing. But what's important is that expressive locutions do not identify new kinds of properties or relations, right? So semantic locutions like true or refer don't denote relations between linguistic and extra-linguistic items, but instead what they're doing is they enable us a kind of new stance toward what's expressed in other assertions. So along these lines, Rouse suggests that invocations of power, properly understood, also do not describe a new kind of substantive property of agents or institutions. Instead, what the concept is doing is that it allows us to express how actions act upon other actions. That is, it allows us to say explicitly what is otherwise only implicit in what we and others do when we navigate concrete social situations in which agents mutually affect the space in which we act. Fourth, and this is a point I think that falls from the previous ones, for Rouse thinks that we should think of power then not as some self-constituted domain of investigation that can be the object of a theory, but instead as providing us one way of looking at the same kind of phenomena that we could also look at in other terms, right? So in, say, economic terms or in terms of knowledge, etc. Right? So this kind of makes the kind of infamous Foucauldian claim that power is everywhere kind of trivial, right? Because the idea is that, well, power relations are just social relations looked at from a particular perspective. Now, this, I think, raises an interesting question about the pragmatics of utterances about power, right? What is it that an agent is doing and trying to achieve by talking about a situation in terms of power rather than in other terms, right? And how does this kind of assertion, right, if it's taken up, potentially reconfigure the space that's being characterized? Right? So by allowing us to make things explicit, expressive vocabularies also allow us to do something new, right? They kind of allow us, for example, to challenge or reason about performances and proprieties that have been made explicit, right? So while Rouse's understanding of power is expressive, it's also, I think, supposed to help us see how claims about power are themselves situated performances in the practices that we observe in terms of power. All right, so I hope that kind of this brief elaboration gives you a better sense of Rouse's claim that power is an expressive concept. And so for the rest of this presentation, I want to kind of briefly think about one, I think, central implication of Rouse's expressive concept of power for thinking about social ontology more generally. So I think that the expressivist account that Rouse proposes provides us with a strategy for making sense of the deep and seemingly intractable disagreements about the concept of power. Right? These disagreements, kind of as I said at the beginning, are often seen as disagreements about what power is, right? So about disagreements about what feature the concept tracks and the explanatory scope and power of that feature. Rouse suggests instead that we should look, at the underlying disagreements about the purposes and norms that guide our practices, and about the significance that causal capacities and constraints have in light of these purposes and norms. So one central implication of Rouse's expressivist conception is that normative assessments are built into any use of the concept of power. So to use it is to take a stand on how the causal effects of people's actions matter, right? It's to take a stand on the significance that these actions have for how others can act and live. Right? So for example, we often talk about power when we observe something as an external imposition on a practice, right? Where what genuinely belongs to the practice, right, or not, is, of course, itself a normative question, right? So if in an academic discussion I need to worry about getting fired for something I say, we might judge this as an unwarranted imposition of norms external to the practice of academic exchange, and thus as an effect of power, right? But this claim itself, of course, depends on normative judgment about the purpose of academic exchange and the significance of various capacities and constraints for this practice. So in many ways, I think Rouse's account captures a central insight of Stephen Luke's well-known claim that power is an essentially contested concept. Luke's has argued that pervasive disagreements about the concept are inevitable, given that its use is inextricably tied to what he calls value assumptions, right? And he thinks that these value assumptions shape the appropriate empirical application of the concept. So Luke himself, for example, defines power in terms of the effects of actions on agents that are contrary to those agents' interests. And then he points out that one important way of exercising power is to influence agents' preferences in ways that are contrary to their objective interests, right? This is Luke's third dimension of power. So judgments about power then rely on the theorist's understanding of what the real or objective interests of agents are, right? In contrast to how they may themselves see their interests or what's in their interest. Now, Luke has been very much criticized for this idea because in the judgment of some critics, right, claims about objective interests seem rather patronizing and paternalistic. But note that the debate between Luke and his critics is, at its core, a debate about the purpose of certain social and political practices, right? Is their purpose, for example, to satisfy certain objective interests dictated, say, by human nature, right? And it's a debate about the significance of certain causal capacities, right? Say the capacities of some economic and social systems to shape the preferences of their participants. Now, others may want to understand the effects of power in, say, terms of resources that allow agents to satisfy their own preferences, whatever they may be, right? But this alternative account is not a more neutral account of power because it also implies judgments about the significance of certain capacities and constraints, right? So, for example, about the kind of always situated capacity to make certain decisions and what kind of implications and what kind of significance this has for the practices in which those decisions are made. So Luke is right, I think, then that different judgments about what counts as power involve normative judgments. And so I think this is where I think Rouse's account and Luke's kind of account overlap. Nonetheless, I think that Luke doesn't always fully appreciate the implications of this point that he makes, right? So Luke frames many of his disagreements about power with other accounts in terms of the explanatory scope and power of the concept, right? And this is apparent, for example, in Luke's discussion with Clarissa Hayward about agent-centric versus structural accounts of power, right? So this debate between the two of them is initially framed in terms of the explanatory power of these different approaches, right, in terms of what the real sources of power are. But when you look at this debate more closely, right, it turns out that the disagreement concerns instead, or really concerns, our practices of assigning moral and political responsibility. So Luke, for example, argues for locating power in agents because he thinks that the point of locating power is to fix responsibility for consequences that flow from the actions or inactions of specifiable agents. And he agrees with Hayward that there are, as it were, structural constraints that can affect how people that affect how people can live and act, right? And so in some ways, he kind of agrees about the kind of explanatory kind of power of appealing to structural constraints when it comes to explaining how that affects how people act. Right? And he thinks we need to attend to those structural constraints, but he believes that many of these constraints should not be attributed to agents, and they therefore require different political responses, right? And so I think that this is a claim about how we should assign responsibility, right? So again, my point here is not to take a side in this debate, but to point out that this is primarily a debate about how we should assign moral and political responsibility, not primarily a debate about kind of causal explanation proper. So if we recognize power's expressive character, right, in the way that Joseph Rouse kind of spells out, then I think the deep and seemingly irresolvable disagreement about what we should or should not count as power is not so much a kind of conceptual epistemic flaw, right, that we might say, oh, well, this is a kind of messy concept that doesn't really allow us to get, at something real, but it's rather central to what the concept of power does, right? It allows us to make explicit and argue about disagreements about what is at issue and at stake in our practices. So I think that, and this will be my last point, recognizing this expressive role of power has important implications for how we think about social ontology and the standpoint from which we do social ontology. So how people can affect the actions of others and kind of shape the practices in which we participate together is, or at least should be, a central concern of social ontology, right? So issues of power should be central to what we think about when we talk about social ontology. But this is not a neutral enterprise that, as it were, takes account of the nature of the social world prior to normative disputes, right? Where we kind of, as it were, just give a neutral, dispassionate account of what the social work is like before we then kind of think about its normative implications. Any account of social ontology already has to take a stand on what the practices it's concerned with are about and how and why they matter. And those are questions that are themselves often contested within those practices, right? So there is no kind of, as it were, neutral way to an already settled way to determine those things. So to leave you with at least with one last example, consider Charles Mill's criticism of John Rawls's consensualist social ontology. That is Rawls's idea that society is a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. Right, and I kind of choose this example in part because there is a kind of a large strand of kind of broadly cooperativist, kind of consensualist social ontology, and so it's kind of worth thinking about kind of what's at stake in those in claims about social ontology. So Rawls's claim that society is a cooperative venture for mutual advantage is not just a neutral observation of social reality, right? It takes a stance on the purpose of our social political practices, right? What are they for? And it takes a stance on the normative significance of the capacities and constraints that emerge from these practices, right? So, for example, right, certain constraints are justified. They make sense because they provide the framework for this cooperative venture that provides mutual advantage to all. So Mill's disagreement with Rawls is then also not merely a disagreement about what the social work is really like, but it's a judgment that involves claims about what is actually at issue and at stake in the social and political practices that we inhabit, right? And it involves claims about the significant ways in which these practices shape how various people, right, can act and live. Right, so we might say that if we actually look at the social material arrangements in which we act, right, the normative significance of those capacities might be that they benefit some people more than others, right, and so that our social practices are not, in fact, about a cooperative venture for mutual advantage, and kind of this attempt to point that out is itself an attempt to reconfigure what these practices should be about, right? So it's not kind of supposed to be kind of neutral, kind of dispassionate claim about what social reality is really like, but rather it's trying to, provide an account of what our practices are and should be about and that's itself kind of supposed to reshape those kind of practices. So Rouse's expressivist conception of power provides us, I think, with a provocative and I think useful understanding of what it is that we're doing when we're doing social ontology. And so I will leave you with that. Thank you.